Moonlight poured through the towering arched windows of the Alpha King's palace, silvering the obsidian floors as servants hurried to complete the final preparations. Banners bearing the royal crest hung from the balconies. Firelight flickered. Power hummed in the air. Alpha King Manuel stood in his private chamber, fastening the ceremonial clasp at his collar, while the low murmur of laughter filled the room behind him. His inner circle, alphas and betas from the highest-ranking packs, lounged with easy arrogance, goblets of aged blood wine in hand. "She won't know where to look," Beta Mark said with a grin, swirling his drink. "An Omega in a room like this? She'll shrink the moment the doors open." Laughter followed, sharp, certain. Manuel said nothing, only checking the time etched into the stone wall. The royal moonlight ball would begin soon. He had extended the invitation himself, carefully, deliberately, not as mercy, as spectacle. Across the kingdom, far from the marble halls and howling banners, Melissa stood alone in the narrow servant quarters, facing a small mirror cracked at the edges. The gown draped over her body was not borrowed, nor gifted. She had stitched every seam by hand, working in silence long after her duties were done. Her fingers tightened briefly in the fabric. She knew why she had been invited. She had heard the whispers. The laughter carried through palace corridors travels farther than kings believe. She could have refused. She could have hidden. Instead, she lifted her chin. Back at the palace, guests began to arrive. Noble packs filled the great hall, their scents mingling with dominance and expectation. Music rose, glasses clinked, eyes turned again and again toward the towering doors. Manuel positioned himself near the entrance, surrounded by his court. This was the moment he had planned for, the stumble, the humiliation, the quiet reaffirmation of hierarchy. "She should be here any moment," Mark murmured. The doors began to open, and Alpha King Manuel stood ready, utterly unaware that the Omega he intended to mock was about to awaken something far older than pride. "If you're listening right now, help me prove my mother wrong. She said I wouldn't reach 2,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe and comment what city you are watching from." Now, let's continue. Moonlight did not soften the laws of the kingdom. It only revealed them more clearly. In the great hall below, hierarchy moved like a living thing. Alphas crossed the floor with unchallenged strides, their scents sharp with authority. Betas followed close behind, voices confident but measured, always careful not to overstep. Omegas drifted at the edges, nearly invisible unless summoned, their heads lowered by instinct as much as training. It had always been this way. The kingdom of Manuel, the unbroken, was built on dominance refined into tradition. From the first howl of a newborn pup, rank was assigned, destiny carved into bone. Alphas ruled, betas enforced, Omegas served. Not because they were weak, so the elders said, but because the world required order, and order required sacrifice. That was the story told in council chambers and etched into stone. Manuel had grown up breathing that belief. As a child, he'd watched his father hold court beneath banners soaked in victory, watched Omegas kneel as naturally as they breathed. He'd learned early that mercy was a weakness mistaken for kindness, that a king who blurred lines invited chaos. When the crown passed to him, he did not question the structure. He perfected it. Under his reign, the kingdom prospered, borders held, rivals bowed. The Alpha throne remained uncontested, and yet, somewhere between marble corridors and ironclad laws, the people who kept the palace running learned how to disappear. Melissa had learned young. She moved through the palace like breath through lungs. Necessary, unnoticed, expected. She woke before dawn to scrub stone floors that never remembered her hands. She kept her eyes lowered not out of fear, but strategy. An Omega who drew attention, drew consequences. Still, the palace whispered to her. It whispered through open doors and careless laughter, through council debates held too loudly, through nobles who assumed silence meant absence. She listened. She always had. Knowledge was the one thing hierarchy couldn't strip from her. She knew the court believed Omegas incapable of ambition, incapable of depth, incapable of strength. She also knew better. Tonight, as she carried folded linens past the grand stairwell, the difference between belief and truth felt sharper than ever. The air was charged. The royal moonlight ball had that effect. Every alpha scent magnified, every beta posturing amplified, every omega pressed further into the margins. She paused only once, briefly, near the archway that overlooked the ballroom. From above, the court glittered, power wrapped in silk and gold. Laughter rang out, confident and unburdened. She spotted Beta Mark easily. He always stood at Manuel's right, his presence loud even when he was silent. His gaze swept the room like a challenge, daring anyone to question their place. No one did. Melissa turned away before she was noticed. Curiosity was tolerated in alphas. In omegas, it was punished. High above, in the private gallery reserved for the crown, Manuel watched the kingdom he ruled with practiced detachment. Everything was where it belonged. Every rank moved in its proper orbit. The balance held. And yet, an unease tugged at him, faint, irritating, easily dismissed. He told himself it was anticipation. The ball was a performance, after all, not just of wealth or power, but of control. Every gathering reinforced the same truth. The throne was absolute, and those beneath it knew their place. That was why the invitation mattered. That was why it amused him. Omegas forget themselves when you give them ideas, Mark had said earlier, his tone casual, cruel in its certainty. Better to remind them. Manuel had agreed. Not aloud, but agreement had lived in the silence between them. Below, a servant dropped a tray. The clatter echoed sharply, drawing glances. The Omega responsible froze, terror blooming too slowly to hide. A beta snapped a command, and the servant scrambled to kneel, apologizing breathlessly. The moment passed. Order restored. Manuel exhaled through his nose, satisfied. This was the kingdom, efficient, predictable, unquestioned. Yet somewhere deep beneath instinct and doctrine, something stirred, an ancient awareness he hadn't felt since his first shift. When the world had sharpened and destiny had seemed as inevitable as blood. He ignored it. Across the palace, Melissa finished her duties with steady hands. She folded the last cloth, smoothed it carefully, and placed it where it belonged. No one noticed when she straightened her spine. No one sensed the quiet resolve settling into her bones. Hierarchy had taught her many things. It had taught her patience. It had taught her restraint. And it had taught her exactly how fragile power became when confronted by truth. Tonight was not about defiance. It was about survival in a world that mistook silence for surrender. As the moon climbed higher and music swelled through the palace, the kingdom believed itself unchanged, secure in its ancient order, blind to the fault line forming beneath its feet. None of them yet understood that hierarchy, once challenged, did not bend. It broke. The palace had a way of making cruelty feel like tradition. It lived in the casual tilt of an alpha's chin when an omega passed, in the clipped tone of a beta issuing commands as if they were breathing, in laughter that never sounded like joy, only permission. Melissa had spent long enough inside these walls to recognize the difference. Tonight, that difference sharpened. The royal moonlight ball had not yet reached its peak, but the inner circle was already gathering in the upper chambers, where the air was warmer, the wine richer, and the rules treated like a private joke. Those rooms were not built for celebration. They were built for power to congratulate itself. Melissa moved through the corridor with a silver tray balanced on her palm, her posture effortless, her eyes down. On the tray, Goblets, a crystal decanter, and delicate slices of rare meat prepared exactly as the Alpha King preferred. She had memorized every preference, every ritual, every unspoken expectation. In this palace, even appetite had rank. A guard at the archway glanced at her and stepped aside without a word. Omegas were allowed in places like this only when carrying something. Melissa crossed the threshold, and the sound hit her first. Low voices, soft laughter, the scrape of a chair, the muted clink of glass. The scent of dominance thickened the air, layered with expensive oils and the sharp bite of aged blood wine. Power always smelled like entitlement. Manuel stood near the tall window, moonlight catching the edge of his dark hair and the line of his jaw. He wasn't drinking yet. He rarely drank before the performance began. A king who lost control was a king who invited challengers. Around him lounged his chosen few, alphas from allied packs, wealthy betas, councilmen who bowed in the ballroom and laughed in private. And at Manuel's right, as always, Beta Mark wore his confidence like armor. Melissa kept her pace steady. She approached the table, set the tray down with precise grace, and began to pour without looking up. She knew better than to meet their eyes. Not because she feared them, because she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her react. "You're quiet tonight," Mark was saying, voice lazy, cruel beneath its smoothness. "Or maybe I've just gotten used to the help moving like ghosts." A ripple of chuckles answered him. Melissa poured the last goblet. Her wrist did not tremble, her breathing did not change. Manuel didn't join the laughter. He watched the room instead, eyes half-lidded, expression unreadable. When he spoke, the sound cut clean through the noise. "The court is bored," he said, like boredom was a problem he could solve with a flick of his fingers. "Too many predictable faces, too many expected conversations." Mark lifted his goblet. "Then give them something unexpected." Manuel's gaze drifted, and for a brief, careless moment, it landed where Melissa stood. Not on her face, not on her as a person, on her as an object in the room. Melissa felt the shift anyway, like a shadow passing over skin. Mark followed Manuel's glance and smiled. "Oh," Mark murmured, as if the idea had just arrived, brand new and brilliant. "That could be entertaining." The others leaned in, scents flaring with interest. Manuel's mouth curved, not quite a smile, more like a decision forming. "You're thinking of her." Mark's grin widened. "Why not? Your Omega Maid, the quiet one, the one who never looks anyone in the eye." Melissa kept her eyes lowered, but her hearing sharpened. Every word sank into her with a cold clarity. "One night," Mark continued, "we let her believe she belongs. We dress her up, throw her into the ballroom, watch her squirm under 100 alpha stares. The court will eat it up." A beta across the room laughed. "She'll faint before the first dance." "Or cry," another added, "and make a scene. Omegas always do when they're overwhelmed." The laughter that followed was effortless, like cruelty was an inside joke they'd been telling for generations. Melissa's fingers rested lightly on the edge of the tray. She kept them still. Manuel's voice remained calm. "She's not the fainting type." Mark tilted his head. "No, she's the prideful type, the kind that pretends she doesn't care. That's why it'll be fun." Manuel turned from the window, slow, deliberate. "And what is the point, Mark?" Mark's eyes gleamed. "To remind her. To remind all of them. You've been too orderly lately, Manuel. Too focused on treaties and council politics. The court misses the old you, the alpha who knew how to put someone in their place with a single glance." A pause. The room waited, hungry. Melissa had heard that tone before, when men baited kings into proving themselves. Manuel's gaze sharpened. "You think I need to prove myself to my court?" Mark lifted both hands in mock surrender. "Not prove. Entertain. There's a difference." One of the councilmen leaned forward. The Moonlight Ball is about power, symbols, tradition, a little theater could help. The others murmured agreement. It wasn't just cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was ritual, reinforcement, a public reminder of what hierarchy meant. Melissa watched the wine catch the firelight, watched their reflection bend in the goblet's curve. They didn't see her. Not really. They saw a role. Mark's voice softened, dangerous. Invite her. Make it official. A personal summons from the Alpha King. She won't refuse. The air thickened as Manuel considered it. He could feel the eyes on him, his court even here, in private, still testing him. He should have dismissed it. He should have ended it with a single word. Instead, something in him, pride, boredom, impulse, shifted. His gaze moved again, finally landing on Melissa's face. Melissa lifted her eyes just enough to register the command in his expression. Not anger, not interest, ownership. "Melissa," Manuel said. Hearing her name in his mouth always felt like a collar tightening. "Yes, my king," she replied, her voice even. Mark's smile turned predatory, as if he was watching prey step into a trap it didn't see. Manuel approached, boots silent against polished stone. He stopped close enough that Melissa could feel the heat of his presence. Alpha scent surrounded her, cedar and smoke and something darker beneath, something old. "You will attend the Moonlight Ball tonight," Manuel said. Melissa did not blink. "As staff, my king?" His gaze narrowed. "As a guest." The room went still. It was the kind of silence that came before laughter, before humiliation. Mark let out a low whistle. "Well, that's generous?" Melissa's chest remained calm, but inside something twisted, not fear, not surprise, confirmation. So this was the shape of the joke. Manuel's voice stayed smooth. "You will wear formal attire. You will enter through the main doors. You will stand among my court." Mark's eyes glittered. "And dance," he added softly, tasting the word. "You'll dance if the king commands it." Melissa's gaze slid briefly toward Mark, not defiant, not pleading, just a quiet, assessing look that made Mark's smile falter for half a heartbeat. Then she lowered her eyes again. "As you command," she said. The response seemed to satisfy them, like submission was the ending they expected. Manuel studied her for a moment longer. His expression remained unreadable, but something in his eyes flickered, an uncertainty so faint it could have been imagined. As if he'd expected her to break, to protest, to show emotion, she gave him none. "Good," he said, turning away as if the matter was settled. "You have time to prepare." Mark chuckled, raising his goblet. "This will be unforgettable." The others echoed him, approval, excitement, anticipation. They were already imagining the spectacle. The Omega trying to mimic nobility, failing under the weight of alpha attention, proving the hierarchy correct. Melissa lifted the tray again, posture perfect. As she moved toward the door, she heard Mark's voice behind her, softer now, meant only for Manuel. "She'll come in trembling," Mark said. "I can already see it. She'll look up at all that power and realize what she is." "And what is she?" Manuel asked, tone almost bored. Mark's answer came like poison wrapped in silk. "An Omega who forgot her place." Melissa didn't pause, didn't look back. She stepped into the corridor, the door closing behind her with a quiet click that felt like a final seal. Only when she was alone did she allow herself a slow breath. The palace hummed around her, alive with music and preparation and arrogance. Servants rushed past, eyes lowered, carrying trays and fabric and candles for the ball. None of them knew what had just been set in motion. Melissa walked through them like a shadow, her mind already calculating, already preparing, because she had heard everything, because she understood exactly what they wanted, and because they were about to learn the difference between an Omega who submits and an Omega who endures long enough to strike. She reached her small room at the end of the servants' wing and closed the door quietly behind her. For a moment she stood still, then she crossed to the narrow chest beneath her bed and pulled it out. Her fingers brushed worn wood, then fabric, folded carefully, protected like something sacred. She lifted the bundle and unfolded it piece by piece. A gown, dark as midnight and soft as whispered vows. Not palace-issued, not borrowed. Made by her own hands in stolen hours, stitched with patience, designed with intention. Her heart did not race, it steadied. They thought they were inviting her to be humiliated. They did not understand. She had been surviving humiliation her entire life. Tonight, she would simply refuse to be broken by it. And somewhere in the palace, Alpha King Manuel, surrounded by laughter and power, believed he had planned the perfect joke. He did not yet know that fate had been listening, and fate did not find cruelty amusing. The door closed behind Melissa with a soft, final click, sealing her away from the laughter echoing through the palace halls. For a long moment, she did nothing but stand there, her palm resting flat against the wood as if feeling the weight of what had just passed through it. So this was how it would be done. Not openly, not with cruelty that could be named, but with spectacle dressed as generosity, a command disguised as an honor. She crossed the narrow room slowly, the stone floor cool beneath her bare feet. This chamber had never pretended to be anything other than what it was, an Omega's space. Small, functional, forgettable. A place meant for rest, not dreams. The irony was not lost on her that tonight, of all nights, this was where her resolve hardened. Melissa sat at the edge of her bed and folded her hands in her lap. She did not need time to understand the invitation. She had understood it the moment Alpha King Manuel spoke her name in that chamber upstairs. She had heard the amusement beneath his calm, the expectation behind his command. More than that, she had heard the silence of the others, thick with anticipation. They wanted her exposed, they wanted her small, they wanted her reminded. The kingdom was very good at reminding Omegas of what they were meant to be. She had been reminded every day of her life. Her mind drifted, not backward in fear, but inward, where memory lived quietly and refused to be erased. Her mother's voice came to her then, as it often did in moments like this, low, steady, unyielding, never confuse obedience with worth. Luna Marissa had said that once, years ago, when the world was different and the pack had still bowed to her name. Melissa had been young then, too young to understand why those words were spoken in a whisper instead of a throne room. Now she understood. Melissa rose and crossed to the small wash basin, splashing cool water against her face. She watched her reflection carefully, dark eyes steady, expression composed. No trace of fear showed there, no tremor. If anything, there was a quiet clarity settling into her gaze. They believed acceptance meant weakness. They were wrong. A knock sounded at the door. "Melissa?" came the voice of another servant, hesitant. "The head steward said you were summoned to attend the ball." As a guest. The pause before the last words was heavy with disbelief. "Yes," Melissa answered calmly. "I was." The door creaked open, and the servant, a young Omega barely past her first shift, peered in with wide eyes. "You don't have to go," she whispered urgently. "Everyone knows what this is." Melissa met her gaze, something gentle softening in her expression. "I know." "Then why?" "Because refusing would give them what they want," Melissa said quietly. A story about an Omega who knew her place too well to challenge it. The girl swallowed. "And going lets me choose how I am seen." The servant hesitated, then nodded, understanding flickering behind fear. "If you need help, I don't," Melissa said, not unkindly, "but thank you." When the door closed again, the room felt steadier, as if the decision itself had shifted the air. Melissa turned back to the chest beneath her bed. She knelt, fingers moving with familiarity, and drew it open. The scent of fabric and time rose softly. She lifted the gown out, unfolding it slowly, reverently. Moon-dark cloth pooled over her hands, catching the faint light from the single window. She had not made it for tonight. She had made it for herself, long before she knew this night would come. Each stitch carried hours stolen from sleep. Each seam was deliberate, restrained, strong. It was not the kind of gown an Omega was expected to wear. It did not beg for approval. It did not soften itself to be palatable. It simply was. Melissa laid it out on the bed and allowed herself one measured breath. Acceptance, she knew, was not submission. Acceptance was strategy. Elsewhere in the palace, anticipation was building like a storm. The court gathered in clusters, voices low but eager. News traveled quickly in places like this, faster than footsteps, faster than commands. An Omega attending the moonlight ball as a guest was unheard of, unacceptable, delicious. Betas speculated openly. Alphas smirked behind raised goblets. Some scoffed, already bored by the outcome they assumed inevitable. Others leaned in, sensing drama ripe for consumption. "She'll embarrass herself," someone said with certainty. "She won't last 10 minutes, another replied. Beta Mark stood among them, basking in it. "Let her come," he said easily. "Reality has a way of correcting delusions." Alpha King Manuel listened from a distance, his expression unreadable. He told himself the invitation had been impulsive, a gesture, a harmless reminder of order. He told himself he felt nothing more than detached amusement. Yet when his mind returned, unbidden, to the look on Melissa's face when he'd spoken, the satisfaction dulled. She hadn't pleaded, she hadn't stiffened, she had simply accepted that more than anything unsettled him. Back in her room, Melissa dressed slowly, deliberately. There was no rush. The palace would wait. It always had. The gown fit her as if it had been waiting for this moment, fabric settling against her skin with quiet certainty. She fastened the last clasp and stood, smoothing the material once, not nervously, but with intention. She did not adorn herself excessively. No borrowed jewels, no borrowed symbols. Only a single silver pendant rested at her throat, worn thin with time. It was the only thing she carried openly from her past. She touched it briefly, grounding herself. When she stepped into the corridor, conversations faltered. Servants paused mid-step. Heads turned. A few gasps slipped free before restraint returned. No one spoke, but the silence followed her as she moved through it, heavy and undeniable. Melissa did not lower her eyes. She walked as she always had, quietly, steadily, but something in her posture had shifted. Not arrogance, not defiance, certainty. Each step toward the ballroom doors felt less like walking into a trap and more like crossing a threshold long denied. She knew what awaited her inside. She knew the stares, the laughter, the test. She knew they expected her to break. Melissa reached the edge of the grand hall, just beyond the open doors, where music spilled out and power pressed thick against her senses. For a brief moment, she paused, not in hesitation but acknowledgement. This was the moment they believed would define her. She accepted the invitation not because she believed she belonged among them, but because she knew exactly who she was without their permission. And with that knowledge steady in her chest, Melissa stepped forward, ready to let the kingdom see what it had chosen to overlook. The doors to the grand ballroom stood open, framed by towering pillars carved with the history of conquest and crown. Music spilled outward in a golden rush, strings and drums woven together in a rhythm meant to celebrate power. Laughter rose and fell like practiced waves. Scent and sound collided in the air, thick with dominance, expectation, and ancient pride. Melissa paused just beyond the threshold, not because she was afraid, because she understood the weight of what came next. Inside, the court glittered. Alphas in ceremonial attire stood beneath hanging crystals that caught the moonlight and fractured it into silver shards. Betas clustered close, voices low, eyes sharp. Even the space itself seemed to hum, as if the palace were alive and listening. At the far end of the hall, near the raised dais, Alpha King Manuel stood with his court. His presence anchored the room. Conversations bent around him. Power answered to his heartbeat. He was mid-conversation when something shifted. It was not loud, not obvious, just a subtle wrongness in the air, like a note struck slightly off-key. His alpha instincts stirred, irritated at first, then alert. He turned his head without fully knowing why. At that exact moment, Melissa stepped forward. The change was immediate. Music faltered, not stopping, but thinning, as if the musicians themselves had forgotten the next note. Voices dropped away one by one. Laughter died mid-breath. Heads turned. Silence spread. Melissa crossed the threshold into the ballroom, moonlight catching the dark sweep of her gown, the fabric moving with her like it belonged there. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. Her steps were measured, her spine straight, her gaze level, not challenging, not lowered, simply present. The court stared. Some recognized her at once and blinked, confusion rippling across their faces. Others felt the disturbance before they understood it, an instinctive prickle at the base of the spine. An Omega was not supposed to enter this space like that. Not like a guest, not like someone who expected to be seen. Whispers sparked and died in the same breath. "That's her, the maid." "Is this a joke?" Beta Mark's smile froze. He had expected discomfort, awkwardness, perhaps tears. What he saw instead unsettled him in a way he did not immediately name. Melissa did not shrink under the weight of the room. She did not falter as dozens of alpha scents pressed against her. She walked as if the air itself parted for her. Manuel felt it then, not as thought, not as emotion, as impact. The moment his gaze locked onto her, something ancient and violent awakened in his chest. His breath caught, sharp and involuntary. The world narrowed, sound dulling, scent sharpening until everything resolved into one undeniable truth. Mate. The word did not come from his mind. It came from bone, from instinct older than crown or kingdom. A pull surged through him, fierce and unrelenting, yanking his attention fully, brutally, toward her. Impossible. Melissa was an Omega, and yet, his alpha flared, a low, dangerous heat flooding his veins. The scent hit him a heartbeat later, wildflower and smoke, something steady beneath it that spoke of resilience and buried strength. It wrapped around his senses, rooted itself there, refused to be ignored. Manuel took a step forward without realizing it. Across the room, Melissa felt it too. It slammed into her like a tide she had never known existed. Her lungs forgot how to breathe for a fraction of a second as awareness tore through her. Sharp, bright, undeniable. Her heart stumbled, then steadied, pounding with a force that echoed in her ears. Mate. The truth settled into her bones with quiet certainty, not panic, not confusion, recognition. Her gaze lifted fully now. Drawn by instinct she had never been taught to name. It found him unerringly, cutting through the crowd, through the noise, through the years of enforced invisibility. Their eyes met. The bond snapped into place. The air between them tightened, electric and heavy, as if the space itself had bent to acknowledge what had just been claimed by fate. A ripple moved through the hall, alphas stiffening, betas frowning, the more sensitive members of the court instinctively stepping back as the pressure rolled outward. "What?" someone whispered. Mark felt it then, too, the shift in Manuel's scent, the sudden flare of alpha dominance no longer contained. His grin vanished, replaced by something close to alarm. Manuel did not hear him. For the first time in his life, the court ceased to matter. All he could see was her, not as an Omega, not as a servant, as the other half of something he had never known was missing. Melissa did not bow. The realization landed harder than any challenge ever had. She stopped at the center of the hall, where the light fell cleanest, and stood with quiet composure. Her chin remained level, her hands rested loosely at her sides. She did not seek permission to exist there. The silence stretched. No one laughed. No one spoke. The musicians, pale and uncertain, continued only because stopping entirely felt wrong. Even so, the music trembled, thin and uncertain beneath the weight of what had just unfolded. Manuel became acutely aware of every eye in the room, every scent of confusion and disbelief. The hierarchy he had enforced his entire reign groaned under the pressure of this single, undeniable truth. His mate was an Omega, and not just any Omega, the one he had summoned to be humiliated. Beta Mark found his voice first, though it lacked its earlier confidence. This isn't funny," he said too loudly. "Manuel, if this is some kind of—" Manuel lifted one hand. The room went still again. His gaze never left Melissa. He should have spoken, should have reasserted control, should have done something, anything, to explain away the sudden fracture in reality. Instead, he felt his alpha bend toward her, protective and fierce, roaring at the injustice of every slight she had endured within these walls. Melissa felt that too, the instinctive reach, the possessive awareness, and for the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed her expression. Not fear, caution. She knew the court, knew how quickly awe could curdle into resentment, how swiftly destiny could become a threat. Still, she did not retreat. The silence began to crack, murmurs spreading in its wake. Shock, disbelief, curiosity, unease. An Omega standing unbowed before the Alpha King. An Alpha King staring at her as if the world had shifted off its axis. The joke had ended the moment she crossed the threshold, and nothing, no title, no law, no carefully enforced hierarchy could undo what had just been claimed by fate. Manuel finally exhaled, slow and controlled, though his pulse thundered. He straightened, instinct and crown warring within him, and took another step forward, this one deliberate. The court watched, breath held. Melissa met him halfway with her eyes alone, steady and unflinching. Whatever came next would not be spectacle. It would be reckoning. The ballroom recovered slowly, like a beast waking from shock. Music resumed with more confidence, though the musicians' hands still trembled when they thought no one was looking. Conversations returned in careful fragments, each one edged with the same question that no one dared speak too loudly. Eyes kept drifting to the center of the hall. Scent shifted as alphas tried to mask their confusion with pride, as betas reassessed alliances in real time, as omegas moved like shadows along the walls and watched with something like hope they didn't understand. Manuel stood where he had stopped, still too far from the dais, still too close to Melissa. He could feel the bond, like a chain drawn tight beneath his skin. Hot, relentless, ancient. It wasn't a thought he could ignore. It was instinct pressing against his ribs, demanding recognition, claiming space inside him that had never been occupied by anything but command. He had built an entire kingdom on certainty. Tonight, certainty cracked. He should have felt anger at fate for mocking him. He should have forced the moment into order with a single decree. He should have dismissed the pull as illusion, declared the bond mistaken, blamed the moon or the crowded scents of the ball. Instead, every time his gaze landed on Melissa, the bond tightened until it stole his breath. She stood with composed stillness, receiving glances the way a queen received petitions, without flinching, without begging, without shrinking into the role the room kept trying to force onto her. She was speaking now with a small group near the marble columns, her voice calm, her posture easy. When someone addressed her with that careful tone nobles used when pretending not to be curious, she answered without apology, without false humility. An Omega was not supposed to do that. Yet there she was, proving the lie of the kingdom with every measured word. Manuel's throat went dry. His mind kept reaching for the familiar scaffolding of hierarchy, trying to pull it back into place. Omegas serve. Alphas rule. The bond is for equals. The bond is sacred. But the bond did not care what he believed. It only cared what was true. He turned away from her abruptly, as if distance could dilute destiny. He moved toward the dais with deliberate steps, forcing his shoulders into the posture of command. A king did not hesitate. A king did not stare at a servant like he'd been struck by lightning. The court watched him carefully, reading every movement like scripture. Mark intercepted him before he reached the steps, slipping close enough that only Manuel could hear. "This is going too far," Mark murmured, his tone tight. "You've made your point. Everyone saw her walk in. Everyone laughed." "No one laughed," Manuel said, voice low. Mark's jaw flexed. "Then make them. Say something. Put her back where she belongs." There it was again. That insistence on belonging, that desperate need to restore the old shape of things. Manuel's gaze flicked back to Melissa without permission. She was still there, surrounded by nobles who pretended their interest was polite. Even from across the room, he could sense her, like a thread attached to his ribs. His alpha rose, restless. "Don't," Mark warned, misreading the look in his eyes as weakness. "Manuel, think. If the court believes you've lost control, they'll smell it. They'll test you." Manuel's fingers curled slowly at his side. He had spent his life ensuring no one ever smelled uncertainty on him, but uncertainty was already in his blood. Mark continued, voice pressing, urgent now. "We invited her to remind Omegas of their place. That's it, a spectacle. You can still control this. Call her forward, make her bow, make her dance. Let the court see she's still an Omega." Manuel's nostrils flared as something bitter rose in his chest. An image flashed, Melissa bowing, not because she chose to, but because he forced her. Melissa dancing under the scrutiny of alphas who wanted to see her stumble. Melissa made small, made less. The bond reacted violently to the thought, like a blade drawn across his nerves. Protect. Claim. The instinct was so fierce it startled him. Mark's voice cut in again. "Say the word and I'll handle it. I'll remind her, in front of everyone." Something in Manuel snapped, quiet but absolute. "You will not touch her," he said. Mark froze, the smile he tried to summon failing at the edges. "What did you say?" Manuel turned slightly, letting Mark see his eyes fully. The air around him sharpened with alpha dominance, a warning made physical. "I said," Manuel repeated, each word controlled, "you will not touch her." The silence between them was thick with challenge. Mark's scent flared, offended, confused, threatened. He tried to mask it with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "You're letting the moment get to you. It's the moon, the crowd, all these scents. It's her," Manuel said, voice like stone. Mark's face twitched. "Manuel, enough." The single word landed heavy. Mark went still, but the anger remained behind his eyes, simmering. Manuel stepped past him and climbed the dais. The room shifted to accommodate him, attention turning like a tide. His court waited for a decree, a joke, an explanation, anything that returned the kingdom to the shape they understood. Manuel placed one hand on the arm of his throne. The carved wood had always felt solid beneath his palm, a reminder of lineage, authority, and the weight of command. Tonight, it felt like something borrowed. The cracks were not in the throne. They were in him. He sat anyway, because sitting was expected. From the throne he could see everything. He could see the nobles leaning together, whispering behind fans and goblets. He could see betas recalculating loyalty, watching for weakness. He could see Omegas pressing closer to the walls, trying to understand whether this moment was danger or miracle. And he could see Melissa. She had drifted toward the edge of the dance floor, as if giving the room space to breathe. Her composure held, but Manuel's alpha senses caught subtler things. the tension in her shoulders when an alpha laughed too loudly nearby, the measured way she inhaled when scents thickened. She was calm, but she was not unaffected. He hated that. Not because she should be unaffected, because he had been the reason she needed to be strong. His chest tightened. The bond pulsed again, steady and insistent, like a second heartbeat. It was not demanding ownership the way Mark would have assumed. It was demanding recognition, reverence, truth, mate. The word echoed through him like a vow he hadn't chosen but could not deny. Manuel had taken lovers, courted alliances, signed treaties that bound pacts with blood and ink. But this was different. This was not politics. This was fate. His mind tried to retreat into logic. The bond could be wrong. Bonds were rare. Bonds between an Alpha King and an Omega Maid were unheard of. There had to be an explanation. Some trick of scent, some long-buried lineage, some... Manuel's gaze sharpened as the thought formed. Lineage. He had always believed rank was destiny, yet rank, he knew, could be manipulated. Bloodlines could be hidden, names could be stolen, pacts had fallen, royals had vanished. His eyes tracked Melissa with new focus, not with suspicion but with dawning awareness. She moved too smoothly for someone raised in servitude. She spoke too carefully, too precisely. Even her silence had control in it, the kind that came from upbringing, not survival alone. How had he not seen it before? Because he hadn't looked. The realization struck him harder than the bond. He had lived beside her day after day and treated her like part of the palace itself, useful, silent, replaceable. He had allowed Mark to speak of her as if she were less than human. He had sanctioned cruelty with inaction. A king's silence was never neutral. It was permission. Manuel's fingers tightened on the throne's armrest until the carved wood creaked softly. He felt eyes on him, councilmen, allied alphas, betas who would turn on him if they sensed wavering. The kingdom demanded strength from its king, not doubt. It demanded certainty even when certainty was a lie. But the bond was not a lie. Melissa was not a lie. He watched as a noble alpha approached her, too close, too smug, curiosity masking condescension. The alpha said something with a smile that looked polite from afar, but carried a sharp scent of superiority. Melissa answered with a calm nod. Then she stepped slightly to the side, repositioning herself with subtle skill, maintaining space without causing a scene. Manuel's alpha surged again, possessive and furious, reacting to the threat in a way Manuel could not fully control. His throne room instincts screamed at him to remain composed. His mate instincts screamed louder. He rose. The movement was small, but it was enough. The nearest courtiers went silent. Heads turned. A ripple moved through the hall as the Alpha King stood from his throne in the middle of his own ball. Mark's gaze snapped to him, alarm flashing across his face. Manuel's heart pounded, not with fear, but with the dizzying sensation of stepping off a cliff he hadn't known was there. He descended the dais slowly, aware of every watching eye, every scent sharpening. The air felt different around him now, thicker, charged with possibility and danger. As he crossed the ballroom, the court parted instinctively, giving him space. Not because they respected Melissa, because they feared Manuel. Melissa saw him coming. Her expression remained controlled, but her eyes narrowed slightly, cautious again, as if she expected the next cruelty to be delivered with a crown. Manuel stopped an arm's length away. For a moment, neither spoke. Up close, the bond was unbearable. Tight, vivid, alive. His alpha wanted to reach out, to touch her, to pull her into the shelter of his dominance and declare to the entire kingdom what fate had done. But he saw the wariness in her gaze and forced himself to breathe. He did not own her. Not yet, not ever, unless she chose it. The thought shocked him. When had he ever considered choice as something an Omega could possess? A crack split clean through his certainty. Melissa's voice was soft, steady. My king. The title held no tremble, no pleading, only acknowledgement. Manuel swallowed, aware of how much was resting on what he did next. His court waited for him to restore hierarchy. Mark waited for him to reassert control. The kingdom waited for its king to decide whether this moment was weakness or prophecy. Manuel's voice came low, controlled, but something in it had changed. Are you well? He asked. The question seemed to confuse the air itself. Melissa blinked once. I am. Manuel nodded slowly, as if confirming something for himself, then, quieter, just for her. I did not expect... He stopped. Because the truth was uglier than expectation. I did not expect you to be more than what I assumed. Melissa's gaze held his. No, she said simply. You didn't. The words were not accusation. They were fact. And for the first time in his reign, Alpha King Manuel, unbreakable, ruthless, status-driven, felt the ground beneath his throne shift. Not because a rival challenged him, because fate had placed an Omega in front of him, and demanded he become worthy of her. The moment did not announce itself with thunder. It crept in on a laugh that lingered too long. Melissa felt it before she heard it, the subtle shift in the room's attention, the way curiosity sharpened into appetite. She had learned to recognize that change the way sailors recognized a coming storm. The court had finished watching her simply exist. Now they wanted to see her tested. Across the ballroom, Beta Mark straightened from the group he'd been holding court with, his expression carefully amused. He raised his voice, just enough for it to carry, just enough to draw attention without seeming deliberate. Well, he said, lifting his goblet, this evening has certainly become educational. A few nobles chuckled. Others turned, sensing spectacle. Melissa remained still, her posture unchanged. She did not need to look at him to know exactly where he stood or how his gaze had narrowed. Mark took a few unhurried steps closer, his smile smooth, rehearsed. Tell me, Melissa, he continued, using her name with false familiarity, are you enjoying yourself? The question sounded polite. The scent beneath it was not. Yes, she answered calmly. I am. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Some were surprised she'd responded at all. Others leaned in, hungry. Mark's smile widened. How fortunate. I was worried this might all be a bit overwhelming for you. His eyes flicked meaningfully around the room. So much grandeur. So many alphas. He let the word hang. I imagine it's not every day an Omega finds herself standing where she doesn't belong. The laughter this time was louder, more assured. Permission had been granted. Melissa felt the weight of the room settle on her shoulders. She had known this was coming, had prepared for it in the quiet of her room, in the stillness of her spine. Still, the heat of humiliation burned, not because of the words, but because of the intention behind them. She met Mark's gaze fully now. I belong wherever I stand, she said evenly. A sharp intake of breath moved through the crowd. Mark's eyes flickered with annoyance, quickly masked. Confidence, he said lightly. That's admirable, though perhaps a little misplaced. He circled her slowly, like a lecturer pacing before an audience. After all, confidence usually comes from position, from rank, from knowing the rules of the world you live in. He stopped just in front of her. And your world, he said softly, so only those nearest could hear, has very clear rules. Silence pressed close. Even the music faltered again, as if the instruments themselves were uncertain. Melissa felt eyes on her from every direction. She was acutely aware of Manuel, somewhere behind Mark, of the bond pulling tight, of something volatile and dangerous coiling in the Alpha King's presence. Mark continued, encouraged by her stillness. Perhaps you could remind us all what it is you do here, Melissa, for the benefit of our guests who might be confused. The question was a blade wrapped in velvet. "I serve in the palace," she replied. Mark tilted his head, feigning thought. "Serve how?" A few chuckles slipped free. Someone whispered, "Say it." Melissa's fingers curled once at her side, then relaxed. Her voice did not waver. "I am a maid." There it was. The word landed with a dull thud, heavy with expectation. Mark nodded as if she'd confirmed something essential. "Ah, yes, a maid." He turned slightly, addressing the surrounding nobles now. "You see, this is why hierarchy exists, so we don't confuse courtesy with equality." A ripple of approval followed. "You clean the palace floors," Mark went on, his tone sharpening. "You scrub the stones our king walks upon. You carry trays and linens and disappear when spoken over. There is no shame in that." The lie sat thick in the air. "But there is danger," he continued smoothly, "in forgetting your place." The words echoed. Melissa felt the heat rise in her chest, not wild, not frantic, controlled, focused, the kind of fire that burned clean. She did not respond immediately. The pause unsettled them. Mark's smile thinned. "Nothing to say?" "I'm considering how much effort you're expending," she replied calmly, "to convince yourself of something you already believe." A few heads turned sharply. Mark laughed, too quickly. "You mistake kindness for weakness, Omega." She lifted her chin just a fraction. "No, I mistake cruelty for insecurity." The air snapped. Gasps, murmurs. Shock flared in scents all around them. Mark's composure cracked for the first time, irritation flashing raw across his face. "Careful," he warned. "You're treading dangerously close to disrespect." Melissa held his gaze, unflinching. "I was invited here, publicly, by the Alpha King." Every eye shifted. Mark stiffened. "As a lesson." "Perhaps," she said, "but lessons tend to work both ways." The silence that followed was brittle. From the edge of the crowd, someone laughed nervously. Another noble shifted, clearly uncomfortable now that the cruelty had lost its easy direction. Mark stepped closer, lowering his voice, sharpening it. "Do you know what happens to Omegas who forget themselves?" Melissa did not move. "Do you know what happens to betas who mistake dominance for worth?" That did it. Mark's scent flared hot and acrid, anger finally breaking free of control. He straightened, voice rising, no longer careful. "This is exactly why this was a mistake," he declared to the room. "Give an Omega a taste of luxury, and she starts to imagine she's something more. Starts to think she deserves to stand among alphas." He turned, gesturing broadly. "Look at her. Dressed in finery she doesn't understand. Pretending she belongs in a world built by bloodlines she will never touch." The words struck like blows meant to bruise, not kill, meant to leave marks. Melissa felt the sting, but she also felt something else now, a strange calm settling over her, like clarity after pain. She spoke softly, but the room leaned in to hear her. "I understand this world very well." Mark scoffed. "You clean it." "Yes," she agreed. "And I listen, and I observe, and I learn." She met the eyes of the nobles watching one by one. "I've learned how easily power becomes lazy, how often rank replaces character, how comfortable people become when they believe the world owes them reverence." The court shifted. Unease crept in. Mark barked a laugh. "Spare us the philosophy." Melissa turned back to him. "You invited me here to remind me of my place," she said. "But the only thing you've proven tonight is how desperately you need me to accept it." The insult landed cleanly. A sharp hush fell. Even those who had been enjoying the spectacle felt the tone shift. This was no longer entertainment. This was confrontation. Manuel's alpha surged violently behind it all, dominance spiking, the bond screaming protest at every word aimed at her. He took a step forward and stopped, because this was not his fight yet. Melissa had not asked to be rescued. Mark's face flushed, rage barely contained. "Enough," he snapped. "You forget yourself." "No," she said quietly. "I remember myself." The words rang. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Mark turned sharply toward Manuel, voice loud enough for all to hear. "My king," he said, bowing just enough to be respectful, "surely you see this for what it is. An Omega overstepping, a disruption. Give the word, and this fast ends now." The room held its breath. Melissa did not look at Manuel. She did not need to. She stood exactly where she was, spine straight, dignity intact, having weathered the storm they'd promised her. Whatever came next, punishment or protection, would reveal more about the throne than it ever would about her. And in that moment, with the court waiting and Beta Mark demanding judgment, the humiliation he had planned began to turn, slowly, inexorably, back toward him. The silence that followed Beta Mark's demand pressed down on the ballroom like a held breath. Every eye turned toward the throne. Manuel stood a few paces behind Melissa, the weight of the crown suddenly heavier than it had ever been. This was the moment the court would remember, the moment whispered about long after the music faded. He could feel the expectation radiating from them, sharp and insistent. A king restores order, a king corrects disruption, a king reminds Omegas of their place. Tradition waited patiently for him to obey. The bond did not. It burned now, fierce and unrelenting, not as possession but as recognition. Every instinct in him roared at the injustice unfolding before his eyes. Not because Mark had challenged him, but because Melissa had been made a spectacle for daring to exist with dignity. Manuel's gaze moved to her. She stood exactly as she had moments before. Calm, composed, her chin lifted just enough to signal resolve without arrogance. She did not look at him. She did not plead. She did not ask for protection. She trusted herself to stand alone. That, more than anything, shattered what remained of his certainty. He had been raised to believe Omegas needed guidance. Control. Correction. That strength flowed only one way, from alpha to lesser ranks. Yet the woman before him carried herself with a quiet authority that did not demand submission or fear. It simply was. Manuel realized, with a clarity that cut deep, that if he turned away now, if he allowed tradition to speak louder than truth, he would lose more than his mate. He would lose himself. He stepped forward. The movement rippled through the room like a stone dropped into still water. Murmurs died. Even Mark's confident posture faltered, his eyes flicking toward Manuel with sudden uncertainty. "My king," Mark said quickly, sensing the shift. "You see how this has gone. The court is unsettled. This display has gone far enough." Manuel did not look at him. He stopped beside Melissa, close enough that the air between them vibrated with restrained power. The bond surged, steadying him, grounding him. For the first time since she had entered the hall, he allowed himself to stand at her side, not above her, not in front of her, beside her. "You asked if I see what this is," Manuel said, his voice low but carrying effortlessly through the hall. "I do." Mark exhaled, relieved too soon. "Then you understand." "I understand," Manuel continued, cutting him off without raising his voice, "that I invited an Omega here under false pretenses." A sharp intake of breath moved through the court. Mark's expression froze. "My king, I understand," Manuel went on, turning at last to face him, "that what was meant as entertainment became humiliation the moment you opened your mouth." The room went utterly still. Mark's face flushed. "I was reinforcing order." "No," Manuel said flatly. "You were indulging cruelty." The word landed heavy, undeniable. A murmur rippled through the nobles, shock, disbelief, unease. No one accused Beta Mark of cruelty. He was tradition incarnate. Enforcement made flesh. Mark straightened, anger flaring hot beneath his controlled exterior. "With respect, Manuel, You are letting instinct cloud judgment. The bond, Manuel echoed softly, is not the problem. He turned to the court now, letting them see his expression fully. Not anger, not doubt, decision. You speak of hierarchy as if it were sacred, Manuel said, as if it were infallible, as if rank alone determined worth. His gaze swept the room, settling briefly on faces that had laughed moments earlier. Yet tonight, an Omega stood before you and showed more restraint, intelligence, and dignity than anyone who sought to put her in her place. The tension thickened. Some shifted uncomfortably, others stiffened, offended. Mark scoffed. You would elevate her because she speaks well? Because she wears a fine dress? Manuel turned back to him, eyes cold. I would defend her because she is right. The words struck harder than a roar. Mark's confidence cracked visibly now. You're undermining the very system that holds this kingdom together. Manuel stepped closer. Alpha dominance rolling outward, not wild, not aggressive, but absolute. The pressure forced Mark back a half step before he caught himself. The system, Manuel said quietly, exists to serve the kingdom, not the other way around. He turned again, this time facing Melissa. She finally looked at him, something unreadable flickering in her eyes. Surprise, caution, a guarded awareness of how much this moment cost him. Melissa, Manuel said, speaking her name with deliberate care. You were invited here to be diminished. The court stirred. That was my failure, he continued, not yours. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. No Alpha King apologized in public, not to an Omega, not ever. Melissa's breath caught, not visibly, but he felt it through the bond, a brief falter before she steadied herself again. Manuel straightened, voice carrying once more. Anyone who believes this court is strengthened by humiliation does not understand strength at all. Mark's voice rose, sharp with disbelief. You would risk dissent for her. Yes, Manuel said without hesitation. The single word fell like a blade. Shock flared across Mark's face. You would risk your throne? Manuel did not answer immediately. He felt the weight of that question settle into his bones. His throne, his alliances, his reputation. Everything he had built by obeying tradition even when it rotted from the inside. Then he looked at Melissa again, at the woman fate had chosen. I will not risk my soul to preserve a lie, he said. The court erupted, not loudly, but with movement. Whispers spread like wildfire. Betas leaned together, recalculating. Alphas bristled, scents flaring as instinct warred with outrage. Some looked at Melissa with new eyes now, no longer amusement, but something closer to awe. Mark shook his head slowly, disbelief giving way to something darker. You're making a mistake. Manuel met his gaze steadily. No, I'm correcting one. He turned fully to the court. Let this be clear, he declared. No one in this kingdom is to demean Melissa again. Not tonight, not ever. Any who do will answer to me. The words settled like law. Mark's jaw clenched. And if the council objects, Manuel's voice hardened, then the council will learn where authority truly rests. Silence crashed down, heavy and irrevocable. Melissa felt the shift like a tide pulling back. The humiliation Mark had tried to carve into her was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous to the old order, validation. She did not smile, did not bow. She simply stood, dignity intact, while the kingdom adjusted around her. Manuel turned to her one last time, lowering his voice so only she could hear. You should not have had to endure that. Her gaze searched his face, measuring sincerity. No, she said quietly, but I did. Something in her tone, neither forgiving nor condemning, made his chest tighten. He inclined his head slightly, not a bow, but an acknowledgement. The court watched in stunned silence as Alpha King Manuel stood openly beside an Omega, defying centuries of expectation. Tradition had demanded obedience. Manuel had chosen truth, and in doing so, he set the kingdom on a path from which there would be no easy return. The court did not explode the way rebellions did in old songs, no claws bared, no howls tearing the ceiling apart. It fractured quietly. That was how power truly panicked. In murmurs that traveled too fast, in nobles who suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere, in betas who watched Manuel with careful, measuring eyes, trying to decide whether his stand was madness or prophecy. Melissa felt all of it the way she felt changes in weather, subtle shifts in pressure, invisible currents tugging at the room. She stood beside Manuel for a moment longer, letting the silence settle into bones. His declaration still hung in the air like law newly written. No one would demean her again. Not tonight. Not ever. Words were easy. What came after words was always harder. Mark recovered first, as men like him always did. He forced a smile back onto his face, though it was sharp around the edges, and turned to the surrounding nobles like he was gathering allies with his gaze. "You're all hearing this," he said, voice loud enough to carry. "The Alpha King himself is dismantling our order for a servant." Servant. The word was a deliberate hook meant to drag Melissa back down. A few alphas stiffened, grateful for something familiar to hold. The court liked structure. It liked certainty. Mark was offering them both. "She's an Omega," Mark continued, stepping forward again, as if the space between him and the throne belonged to him by right. "A maid. And now we're meant to pretend she's equal, that she deserves protection like she's royal." He laughed, and the sound was intended to invite laughter. Some answered, hesitant. Others did not. Melissa felt the bond tighten at her side, Manuel's alpha reacting, dominance coiling. She could have let him silence Mark. She could have stood back and allowed the king to fight the battle he'd started. But something in her refused, not pride, truth. She had endured too long in silence to let her life be defined by someone else's mouth. Melissa stepped forward. The movement was small, but it drew every eye. Even Mark's words stuttered to a pause, his gaze snapping to her as if he'd forgotten she could move without being commanded. The music had stopped entirely now. The musicians sat frozen, bows hovering above strings as if afraid any sound might shatter what was happening. Melissa's voice was calm when she spoke, but it carried easily, cutting through the hall with a clarity that made whispers die. "You're right about one thing," she said, looking directly at Mark. "I am not what you've decided I am." Mark's eyes narrowed. "We know exactly what you are." Melissa turned slightly, letting her gaze sweep across the nobles. Alphas and betas who had laughed, those who had watched, those who had quietly enjoyed the humiliation until it became uncomfortable. "You know what I've been forced to be," she corrected. "What you've allowed me to be in your minds because it made you comfortable." A ripple moved through the crowd. Unease shifted into something sharper. Mark scoffed. "Listen to her. She's drunk on attention." Melissa's expression remained unchanged. "No, I'm sober on truth." The words landed hard. Mark's face flushed again, anger flaring. "Truth! You're a maid who cleans floors. That's the truth." Melissa didn't flinch. "Yes, I cleaned your floors. I served your wine. I kept my eyes lowered because it was safer to be invisible than to be punished for being seen." Her gaze drifted to the throne, to Manuel, not seeking permission, acknowledging what stood beside her now. "But you've all made the same mistake," she continued, voice steady. "You thought my silence meant emptiness. You thought my rank meant my blood." Mark's smile returned, brittle. "And now you'll claim you have royal blood?" Melissa breathed once, slow, controlled. "I don't have to claim it," she said. "It's already mine." The air went still again. Somewhere in the crowd, an elder alpha inhaled sharply, scent shifting to alarm, like something in Melissa's tone awakened recognition. Mark laughed too loudly. "Prove it!" Melissa's fingers lifted to the silver pendant at her throat. The small piece of metal had rested against her skin for years, a quiet weight she never removed. She slid it free of the gown's neckline and held it out in her palm. The pendant was a crescent moon, worn at the edges. At its center was a tiny etched crest, a sigil so old most of the court had only seen it in tapestries or council records. The crescent and the wolf, the mark of Luna Marissa. A hush fell so deep it felt like the entire kingdom held its breath. Several nobles leaned forward unconsciously. A few stepped back, sense spiking with sudden fear. History was dangerous in a court built on erased bloodlines. Mark's laughter died in his throat. "That's," someone whispered, barely audible. Melissa's gaze did not waver. "My mother wore this," she said simply, before she vanished. A ripple of shock spread like wildfire. Luna Marissa's name was not spoken often in this kingdom. It was the kind of name that haunted council chambers, that lingered in old alliances and unresolved betrayals. A Luna of a powerful pack, gone without a corpse, gone without explanation, leaving behind a trail of rumors and silence. Mark swallowed. "That's a stolen trinket. Any Omega could—" "It isn't stolen," Melissa said, cutting through him with ice. "It was given to me the night she disappeared, with one command." Her voice softened for the first time, not with weakness, but with a quiet grief that carried weight. "Live," she said. "Hide, and never let them turn you into their lesson." Melissa lifted her chin again, grief settling behind her eyes without spilling over. "My name," she said, "is Melissa Marissa's blood." A collective gasp rose. Mark took an involuntary step back. Manuel felt it like a blow, the bond flaring, recognition slamming into him with brutal clarity. This was why fate had chosen her. This was why her presence had commanded the room. This was why she moved like nobility, spoke like legacy, carried herself like a queen denied a crown. Blood called to blood, and the kingdom had been blind. A councilman near the dais went pale, eyes fixed on the pendant as if it were a weapon. "That crest was sealed," he whispered to the alpha beside him. Marissa's line was declared extinct, someone finished, voice trembling. Melissa's gaze snapped to them. "Declared extinct," she repeated softly. "Convenient, wasn't it? A Luna vanishes, and her bloodline disappears with her. No questions, no investigation, just a sealed record and a new story." Murmurs rose louder now, people shifting, glancing at one another with sudden suspicion. Old politics surfaced, sharpened by the threat of truth. Mark found his voice again, desperate. "Even if you are her daughter, that doesn't change your rank. Blood doesn't erase what you are." Melissa's eyes narrowed, quiet fury waking in their darkness. "You mean it doesn't erase what you've decided I should be?" she said. "Because your world needs Omegas to stay small. It needs them to remain proof that hierarchy works." She stepped closer, stopping where only a few paces separated them. Mark's scent was sharp with panic now, though he tried to mask it with arrogance. "You humiliated me tonight because you thought I was powerless," Melissa continued, voice still calm, still controlled. "But what frightens you isn't my gown, or my words." She lifted the pendant slightly, letting it catch the moonlight. "It's this," she said, "because it means you have to confront a truth you've spent your life avoiding." Mark bared his teeth slightly, anger and fear twisting together. "And what truth is that?" Melissa's gaze swept the room once more, taking in the nobles, the council, the allies, who suddenly looked less certain. "That worth was never tied to rank," she said. "That nobility was never something you owned. and that your precious order is built on the suffering of those you refuse to see." Silence hit again, heavy and final. Manuel stepped forward then, not to take over, not to silence her, but to stand with her fully now. The court watched him do it, watched the Alpha King align himself with a woman who had just upended centuries of political myth with a single pendant and a single name. Mark's eyes flicked between them, searching for a crack, a weakness, an opening. He found none. Melissa's voice dropped, quieter, but the entire hall leaned in as if drawn by instinct. "I did not come here to beg for acceptance," she said. "I came because you invited me as a joke." Her gaze slid to Manuel for the briefest moment. Acknowledgement, not forgiveness. "And I walked through those doors anyway," she continued, turning back to the court. "Because I wanted to see if you were truly what you pretended to be." A slow breath. "Now you've seen me," she said. "And the question is, can you see yourselves?" The silence that followed was not the silence of entertainment. It was the silence of reckoning. Because in one night, in one ballroom, Melissa had done what no Omega was ever meant to do. She had spoken her lineage aloud, and the kingdom could never unhear it. The first thing that broke was not the hierarchy. It was the illusion that everyone believed in it for the same reason. The ballroom remained silent for a long, suspended moment after Melissa's final words, as if the palace itself were waiting to see which side of history the court would choose. The music did not return. The chandeliers continued to burn, throwing light across faces that now looked different, less polished, less certain, stripped down to instinct. Then the murmurs began. Not laughter, not gossip, calculation. Nobles leaned together, whispering with the urgency of people who had just realized the ground beneath them was not stone, but ice. Councilmen stared at the pendant in Melissa's hand as if it had become a blade. Betas exchanged glances that said alliances could be rewritten in a single night. Alphas bristled, scents flaring, their dominance reacting not to an Omega's defiance, but to the danger of a forgotten bloodline returning. Melissa felt it like pressure against her skin. She had expected outrage. She had expected disbelief. She had expected someone to shout her down, to demand proof, to drag her away and bury the truth where they had buried her mother's name. What she had not expected, what no one could fully prepare for, was how quickly power reshaped itself around a new center. Because names mattered here. Blood mattered. And Luna Marissa's blood had just stood in the heart of the court and refused to bow. Mark moved first, because men like him could not survive silence. His face had drained of color, but his eyes burned with something desperate and vicious. "This is treason," he snapped, voice cracking as he tried to force authority into it. "This is a manipulation, some trick to embarrass the court and weaken the crown. Manuel, you can't allow this." He turned toward the nobles, trying to rally them with outrage. "You all heard her. She's accusing the council of erasing a royal line. She's accusing us—" "She's speaking truth," an elder Alpha interrupted, voice low and heavy. The interruption cut through Mark like a claw. All eyes turned. It was Lord Garrick of the North Ridge Pack, ancient, scarred, respected, a man whose loyalty had never been questioned because his pride was too old to bend for convenience. He stepped forward slowly, his gaze fixed on the pendant. "I stood at Luna Marissa's coronation," Garrick said. "I saw that crest with my own eyes. I watched her swear her oath beneath the moon." A shocked ripple ran through the court. Mark's mouth opened, then closed. You're mistaken," Garrick's lip curled slightly. "No, I'm remembering." The word felt like a verdict. Another voice joined, hesitant but clear. "My mother spoke of Marissa," a noble woman said from the edge of the crowd. "She said Marissa vanished the night she refused to sign the council's treaty. She said the council feared her influence." The murmurs swelled, gaining shape. Old stories surfacing, old suspicions finding air. Mark's control began to unravel. He pointed at Melissa, as if accusation could turn truth into ash. Even if she's who she says she is, she's still an Omega. Rank isn't changed by blood. Melissa watched him, calm in a way that made his frenzy look uglier. "You're right," she said quietly. "Rank isn't changed by blood." Mark seized on it. "Exactly. She's admitted, but worth is," Melissa finished, her eyes sharp. "And that is what you can't stand." Mark's face twisted. "You don't get to define worth." A quiet sound escaped the court then, soft, almost involuntary. A laugh, not amused, amazed. It came from a young beta lord near the dais. He looked between Melissa and Manuel with dawning realization. "She's his mate," he whispered, as if saying it aloud made it more real. "That's why—" The mate bond. The words hit the room like fire poured onto dry grass. Scent surged. Alphas stiffened. Betas went still. Even those who had been clinging to hierarchy felt instinct tug at their ribs. Fate was not a political argument. Fate was law older than councils, older than thrones, older than the stories kings told themselves to sleep at night. Mark turned sharply to Manuel, panic and fury flashing. "No," he said harshly. "No, you can't." Manuel stepped forward, and the room felt the change instantly. He did not roar. He did not need to. His dominance unfurled like a storm held in perfect control, pressing outward until even the proudest alphas felt their instincts urge stillness. The court quieted, not because they agreed, but because their bodies remembered what a true alpha king was. Manuel's gaze swept over them, cold and steady. "You will not speak over her again," he said. Mark's jaw clenched. "Manuel, I said," Manuel repeated, voice low enough to vibrate through bone. "You will not speak over her again." Mark froze. For the first time that night, he looked uncertain. Not because Manuel had threatened him before. Manuel always threatened. But because this threat carried something deeper than politics. It carried devotion. It carried fate. Manuel turned toward Melissa then, and something in his expression softened. Not weakness, not sentiment, reverence. The court watched, stunned, as the Alpha King lowered his head slightly. Not a bow to an Omega, an acknowledgement to a mate. "I felt the bond the moment you entered," Manuel said, his voice carrying through the hall. "I tried to deny it, because it did not fit the world I've built." His eyes flicked briefly to the throne behind him. "I was wrong," he continued. "Not about fate, about everything." The confession landed like a crack through stone. Mark's voice rose, strained. "You can't rewrite the kingdom because you feel—" Manuel snapped his gaze to him. "I'm not rewriting it because I feel." A pause. "I'm rewriting it because it's rotten." Silence slammed down, heavy and absolute. Melissa's heart beat steadily, but the bond thrummed now, responding to Manuel's words like something being mended at the seam. She had not come here for this. She had not revealed her lineage to claim a crown. She had revealed it to claim her name. Yet fate, as always, demanded more than a single truth. Manuel took a step closer to her. Every alpha in the room tracked the movement like prey watching a predator shift its weight. Every beta held their breath. Even the servants pressed against the walls, eyes wide, their world changing without permission. Manuel stopped directly before Melissa, close enough that she could feel his heat, close enough that the scent of him wrapped around her senses, cedar and smoke and storm, but beneath it now, something quieter, regret. Melissa met his gaze, expression unreadable. "Say it," Mark hissed, barely containing himself. "Claim her. Mark the Omega like property and prove you've lost your mind." Manuel did not look away from Melissa. "I won't claim her like property," he said, voice calm. The statement stunned even those who hated her, because every alpha knew what claiming meant in this kingdom, dominance pressed into skin. Obedience demanded, a bond used like a chain. Manuel's jaw tightened. "I will claim her," he continued, "as my mate." A tremor moved through the court. Melissa's breath caught, not in fear, not in shock, but in the sharp awareness of choice. Manuel lifted his hand slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. He did not touch her, not yet. His voice lowered, meant for her alone, though the room listened anyway. "I can't undo what I did tonight," he said, "or what I allowed before tonight, but I can choose what I become after." Melissa's eyes held his, searching. The bond tugged, not forcing, not commanding, asking. Manuel swallowed once, then spoke with quiet force. "Will you stand with me? Not will you kneel, not will you obey. Stand." The question struck deeper than any vow. Melissa's throat tightened. The memory of her mother flickering through her mind, Marissa's smile, Marissa's warning, Marissa's disappearance. The weight of legacy pressed against her spine, heavy and sacred. She looked past Manuel, briefly, toward the throne. So much power had been exercised from that seat without tenderness. So much law had been spoken without compassion. If she took this step, she would not simply become a mate. She would become a challenge to every old rule. Melissa returned her gaze to Manuel. "I will not stand beside you," she said softly, and the court's breath collectively stopped. "If you expect me to be silent again." Manuel's eyes sharpened, and something like relief flashed there. "I don't," he said. "I need you not to be." The words rang with truth. Melissa lifted her chin, then slowly, deliberately, she placed her hand in his. The bond surged, bright, inevitable, flooding her senses with heat and certainty, so intense the world seemed to sharpen around it. Manuel's alpha shuddered with the force of it, the storm in him finally recognizing what it had been denied. A sound rose in the room, not laughter. A stunned, ragged exhale. Mark staggered back half a step, as if the sight of their hands, joined physically, struck him. "No," he whispered again, but it sounded small now. "You'll destroy everything." Manuel turned his head slightly, his gaze sliding to Mark with icy finality. "Everything that deserves to survive will survive," Manuel said, "and everything that doesn't—" He let the sentence hang. The implication was clear. The court shifted, the fracture becoming a collapse. Those who had supported Mark looked suddenly uncertain. Those who had hated the cruelty looked newly emboldened. Servants watched with wide eyes that held something dangerously close to hope. In one night, the hierarchy had not politely evolved. It had cracked open, and through the crack, something new was forming, painful, inevitable, alive. Manuel lifted Melissa's hand, not as a trophy, but as a statement. "This is Melissa," he declared to the court, "daughter of Luna Marissa, and my mate." A ripple ran through the hall like a wave striking shore. Some bowed instinctively, less to Melissa, more to fate. Others remained frozen, still clinging to the ruins of what they had believed unbreakable. Mark's face twisted, fury and fear warring. He looked around as if searching for allies, for the old world to rise and defend him, but the old world was collapsing under the weight of truth. Manuel did not return to the throne. He walked past it, and the act was symbolic enough to feel like a crown being reforged. With Melissa at his side, he moved toward the center of the ballroom, the heart of the kingdom, the place where eyes gathered and history was written. The court parted, uncertain and shaken. Melissa's pulse remained steady. She did not feel triumphant, she felt wake. This was not an ending. It was the first breath of a new reign, one that would not be built on who was allowed to stand tall, but on who had been forced to kneel. The music, tentative at first, began again, low, trembling, then steadier, not celebratory, transformative. And as the moon climbed higher above the palace, fate had already made its decision. The kingdom would either learn to change, or it would break completely trying to resist.